The driver come and hit my mother. When them hit my mother, my father say, we don't have no right to hit big wife. Because India rule is that. He say, them tell my father, the man and them tell my father. He say, look how he hit Bhauji. He say, nah, we want to go India again. From Pitimon, them start to come San Fernando. From San Fernando, them watching the sea, very high road to pass, very high road.
Purnima's father's objection is informed by the thesis that flogging and incarceration for minor law-breaking and misdemeanors was not written in his contract. As a consequence, many of the Jahajis believed that they were deceived.
This was never told in the contract. I've seen the contract, the original contract, that is never mentioned. And while that was the central feature of the indenture system, that if you didn't work or if you had some misdemeanor, it's a huge variety, about 140 clauses were there, from hospital rules to barrack, how do you keep your barrack house, to how do you work. There were 140 types of breaches. And then you could be in jail. And as you know that amongst the labor, roughly the average rate of incarceration, that means being prosecuted for, was something like 25–30%. So every person in his period of, most probably on an average, every person might be in jail for at least 14 days.
Additionally, overseers would command some women to report to their bungalows for disguised house chores, where they would be abused and violated. In many instances, the overseers would manufacture reasons to imprison some husbands in order to commit their acts of brutality against these innocent women.
The overseers were nearly all young men, unmarried men. Most of them were white. I guess a few were local mixed-race men. And they were in the middle of a population of resident laborers, some indentured, some not. But these were all people who were very much in the power of the estate management. And obviously that was a situation reminiscent of slavery, where the young women were vulnerable to sexual predators among the management staff. So there's no question that this did happen. Now, it was, of course, frowned on by the local government, by the Protector of Immigrants Office, and by the more intelligent managers, because they recognized that perhaps no other issue caused so much discontent and so much rebellion among the estate indentured labor force than interference, as it was politely called, with the Indian women.
The system of recruitment paid lip service to sociological factors, in particular the imbalance of men to women ratio, despite the fact that the authorities had mandated that women constitute 1/3 of every shipload of immigrants coming to the West Indies. The planters were desperate for muscle labor on the plantations. The Arcatias, on the other hand, were only interested in satisfying their depraved lust for wealth. However that was achieved was their major concern.
Obviously, what happens is that if you have a system of labor, you're trying to attract labor. What was required at first was able-bodied labor to work on plantations, and able-bodied labor was generally seen as male labor. So the system started with obviously more men. However, within the plantations and on the estates where many men were housed, there began to be problems of just, I would call it unhappiness of various sorts. You have to remember as well that you are drawing men from India who are young, who within India they would have had their lives arranged. They would have had arranged marriages, they would have had the usual rug of customs around them, and you are now displacing them. And you bring them into a setting in which they are now ill at ease.
Indentureship also created new ways in which Indian women and men viewed each other, away from the protective surveillance of their parents.
You began to have a group of women who are now again displaced from India, in where they also would have had their lives arranged, and where they would have been not in short supply. They are shifted to Trinidad and to the rest of the Caribbean, and they are now in greater demand. So you begin to change the entire system of sexuality, if you like, of the way in which Indian men and women would have related to each other if they were in India, under the eyes of their family.
The indentured female, already in short supply on the plantations, could now bargain with the currency of her sexuality, and this resulted in bitter social problems like domestic violence, wife murders, and suicides.
I think once you disrupt any set of migrants, you begin to create problems. And what became more popular, and what we know more, is the whole notion of wife murders. And men would then maybe maim or kill their wives. But what was not mentioned as much was the amount of men who also committed suicide on doing that. So I think one has to be very careful in looking at the area to see that both men and women suffered. However, it has left a kind of legacy for us of the notion of very violent coolie behavior.
I think a lot of women were routinely beaten, and occasionally these kinds of episodes climaxed in murders of women by their husbands. Usually, of course, the woman was dead, so she couldn't bear testimony, but in the trials that resulted, the argument always was that she had been unfaithful to him, she had left him, and his honor required that he should kill her. And quite a few men were, in fact, convicted and hanged for murdering their wives under these circumstances. And historians are quite sure that this comes out of the special situation, the very distorted living conditions on the plantations. It happened in Guyana, in Mauritius, in Fiji. It was a common pattern where you had the people living together with a skewed sex ratio and under very peculiar living conditions.
Unable to withstand the pains of separation coupled with the rigors of plantation life, many an immigrant male ended up destitute or on the wayside, with the colonial authorities taking no responsibility for these helpless souls.
Despite these harrowing experiences, the immigrants survived and prospered through various means, particularly through their religion, during which they recreated village India as perhaps the most strategic form of survival.
A strange land, and peoples whose cultural inheritances were different to theirs, but who experienced an historical sameness. The daunting circumstances of a journey they'd never forget, and the trials of a difficult plantation life. The immigrants summoned their survival instincts. On the estates, they maintained a self-inflicted separation from within their own groups and from mainstream Trinidadian society. This perhaps was a hangover from the extremely strong caste system that existed in colonial India. Invariably, tempers would flare and sharp quarrels would develop among the Jahajis. But open hostility towards them from the freed African slaves, coupled with the nakedness of a brusque plantation environment, they were compelled to dismantle whatever social or religious barriers existed among them. Walls broken down and the quest for survival prominent on their agenda, these Jahaji Bhais and Bahins weaned into their small communities a compelling sense of togetherness and cooperation. Cultural practices deemed pagan by the British and considered strange to others who preceded the immigrants made it difficult, almost lawless, to practice their religions and invoke their cultural prowess.